Well, I have one more story for you about a story souvenir from a trip that was not a geographic trip, not a physical trip. It was a trip down memory lane. It was a trip that I took with a friend of mine. I'm going to call him Jack. Jack, a lifelong Yankee, moved to Birmingham about 10 years ago to live closer to one of his daughters who lives here. Jack moved into a retirement community up there in Birmingham, a beautiful, comfortable, really lovely place where I sometimes go to tell stories. And Jack and I bonded immediately over the fact we both speak with a Yankee accent, and we lived for a time in Pennsylvania. Jack was always the most upbeat, most jolly, cheery person in the room anytime I went out there. He always wanted to tell me he loved this new place where he lived. He loved all the new friends he'd met. He loved the activities he had. They had yoga class on Tuesdays and book club on Wednesdays and party nights on Fridays. Sometimes that movie with popcorn. He loved his new life there. And then came COVID. And everything shut down. You remember, especially the early months, where people were desperate to figure out what was safe and what was dangerous, and especially retirement communities, being very, very cautious, went into lockdown. Not people like me not allowed in, the residents were not allowed out. Not allowed out of the building, they were not allowed out of their apartments. No going down to the lobby to check on the mail, no shared meals in the dining room, no yoga class, no book club, no movie night. They had to stay in their apartments by themselves, and the only people they saw were the staff members who came around to take their temperature and drop off meals on a tray. But there was still the telephone. And maybe 2-3 months into it, I was just at home by myself too, so I was just calling people just to chat, and I called Jack. And we talked about how crazy and upside down everything felt, how isolating it all was. And I said to him, Jack, you're 94 years old. I know you've been through a lot in your time, but have you ever been through anything like this? Have you ever been through a time when you felt like your world completely turned upside down? Have you ever felt completely alone? I thought he'd say no. I thought he'd say, you're right, 94, I've seen it all, but nothing like this. But he didn't. He just thought a moment. And then he told me a story, told me his story, a story so full of heart and hope and generosity of spirit, I knew I could not be the only person to hear it. And so I asked Jack if I could call him right back, and would he tell me that same story again, but let me record it so that I would have his words, and then could I tell that story to other people? And he agreed that if I changed his name and other identifying details so he could stay anonymous, I could do that. And so I want to tell you the story just the way he told it to me, which is in the first person. But to do that, I need your help, because I do not speak with the voice of a man who was born in New York City in 1928. I do not look like a 94-year-old man who is now confined to a wheelchair because of a stroke that snuck up on him in the middle of the night 7 years ago. And so I have to ask you to use your imaginations, as you always do, for my stories, and I so appreciate it. But I need you to see Jack in your mind's eye and hear his voice tell his story. So what did you ask me? Was there ever a time I felt like the world turned upside down? Was there ever a time I felt completely alone? I wish I could say no, but that wouldn't be true. We were living in New York City. It was 1939. I was 11 years old. I had two brothers. One was 13, one was 8. So I was in the middle, which is a good place to be. The older one takes the heat for everything, and the younger one gets spoiled. So the middle's a good place to be. Our father had been out of work for 2 years. It was 1939. We had nothing. We were at the bottom of the barrel. I mean, I don't want to be, we had nothing. We'd been living in a nice house on Long Island. With my father out of work for 2 years, we lost that house. Moved into Manhattan into a 5-story tenement building. Must have been 100 people living in that one building. And the clothes we had on our backs were secondhand, hand-me-downs. So we had nothing. But you know what? We had each other. We had our family. We were poor, but we weren't miserable. To my brothers and me, that's just the way things were. My grandfather, my father's father, lived in Rochester, New York. His wife, my grandmother, had passed away a few months earlier, so he was a widower. He was living up there by himself. Now, communications then were not what they are now. Not only did we not have text, we didn't have email, we didn't have telephone. Just the one in the telephone booth down at the corner, down the street. For 2 years, my father had not wanted to do this, but finally he walked down to that phone booth, he called my grandfather. And my grandfather said, bring the family up here to Rochester, I'll put you to work. My grandfather had a small manufacturing business, employed about 10 people. And he said, bring the family up here, I'll put you to work. So we moved up there. It was July 1939, I'll never forget it. So we moved up there, moved in with my grandfather. And my father was back at work, but we were living in very tight quarters. And somehow my mother just couldn't take it. She lasted 3 months. We moved up there in July, and in August, she left. Just walked out. There was no clue, no indication. Well, maybe I did have one clue. The morning she left, I'll never forget it. It's like it's embedded in my mind. That morning, my brothers and I were leaving for school, and as she always did, she would kiss us goodbye as we walked out the door. Now maybe, I don't know, maybe it was my ego. I always wanted to have the last kiss. And that morning, when she gave me the last kiss, she started crying. I said, Mama, what's wrong? She wouldn't tell me. Well, that afternoon, my brothers and I were walking home from school. We lived right on the bus route, not the school bus route, the regular bus route. In fact, our house was 2 houses down from the corner where the bus stop was. And as we got closer to the house, we were still maybe about a block away. We could see our mother standing there at the corner waiting for the bus. The bus got there before we did. She got on, and the last glimpse we had of our mother was of her looking at us through the window as the bus rolled by. The story does not have a happy ending. She never came back. I saw her 3 more times in my whole life. She never came back. So do I know what it feels like to have your world turned upside down? I think so. That was a bad thing. But you know what? There was something good that came out of it. In fact, there were a couple of good things that came out of it. And one good thing was my brothers and I became very close. Instead of squabbling and fighting all the time like a lot of brothers do, we became very close to each other, maybe because we'd all been through this terrible tragedy together. And that close bond stayed with us the rest of our lives. I mean, they're both gone now, but even when we were grown, married, living in different cities, every year we'd get together, always had the greatest reunion. So that was a good thing that came out of it. And another good thing that came out of it was our relationship with our grandfather. After Mother left, he took on the role of mother for us. I mean, he cooked and cleaned for us, but more than that, he took on that wonderful motherly role. He listened to us, he talked to us, he nurtured us. He tried to teach us the importance of living. He loved his life. He wanted us to love our life too. He had a big personal library there in the house, and he was always wanting to get us to read. He loved to read, wanted us to love it too. He was always giving us books. I know the first book he ever gave me was Tom Sawyer. Oh, I love that book. Another book he gave me was a biography of Edward Bok, B-O-K, Edward Bok. He was a Dutch immigrant, became a world-famous botanist. Never forget that book. So this was a wonderful thing our grandfather did for us. Taught us to love books, love reading, love life. It was a generous thing he did for us. So that was a good thing that came out of it. You know, sometimes what starts out looking like a bad thing turns out to be a good thing. You just can't see it in the beginning. You got to wait to see it. My father got married again. This makes me laugh. It was 1944, 5 years after Mother left. We're all still living there with my grandfather in Rochester. One day, my father goes off to Massachusetts, and he marries this woman he met before he knew our mother. Never said a word about it beforehand. He just goes off to Massachusetts, gets married, brings her back with him, and says, "Here's your new mother, boys." Talk about having your world turned upside down. I was 15 at the time. My older brother was 17. This was a tough transition for us. My younger brother was only about 12. It wasn't as hard for him, but for my older brother and me, this was not a good fit. And then what happened next? So it's 1944, and we're living there in Rochester, all of us, my grandfather. In May, my father goes and gets married. In June, I finished junior year of high school. In July, my older brother joins the Navy. And in August, the four of us, my father, his new wife, my 13-year-old brother, 16-year-old me, we moved to Springfield, Massachusetts, where my father's new wife has a house. And we move into that house. So a year goes by. I graduate from high school. I get some kind of job. I'm 17 years old. And one day, my father tells me that he's taken a new job in a city many miles away. And he announces that since I'm out of high school and have a job, I will not be moving with the rest of the family. He's arranged for me to rent a room in a boarding house there in Springfield. I had no clue this was going to happen. So that's the time I felt completely alone. But that's another time when what started out looking like a bad thing turned out to be a good thing. Because a year earlier, when we first moved to Springfield, we moved into that house. It was about half a block away from this ball field. There were always kids playing at the ball field. So one day, soon after we move in, my kid brother and I go over to the ball field. This kid, maybe about my age, he calls out to us. He says, "Hey, you guys, you want to join us?" Now, isn't that something? Here we are, complete strangers, and he invites us to join in. So we did, and had a great time. Well, that kid's name was Bobby Grant. And Bobby Grant and his family lived on the other side of the ball field. Bobby and I became great friends. A year goes by, and I tell Bobby what's going on, how my family's moving. They're leaving me there at a boarding house in Springfield. And Bobby goes home and he says to his mother something like, I'm paraphrasing here. He says something like, "Mom, we can't let this happen to Jackie. We got an empty room up in the attic. Can't we clean it out and have Jackie move in with us?" And she says, "Of course." And so I did. I moved in with Bobby's family. It was like an unofficial adoption. They adopted me. I adopted them. So I got this whole new wonderful family out of it. So that was a good thing that came out of a bad thing. But an even better thing that came out of it was this. When I first met Bobby, we were just starting to be friends. One day we're walking home, and this little girl walks by. She's, 11, 12 years old. She sticks out her tongue at Bobby, and she goes, "Yeah, yeah, yeah." I said, "Who's that?" He said, "Oh, I don't pay any attention to her. She's my kid's sister." I had no idea. 10 years later, I would marry her. When I first moved in with her and the family, she was like a sister to me. I was like a brother to her. In fact, later on, she told me she looked on me as her nice brother. Because she was always fighting with the other two, but she looked on me as a nice brother. So 3 years go by. I'm 20 years old. I decide to join the Navy. And the night before I'm supposed to leave, they have a farewell party for me there at the house. All the kids from the neighborhood come over. I say kids, they're 17, 18 years old. You know how teenagers are. We played a game. Maybe you've played this game. Spin the bottle. Well, Beth was there. That was her name, Beth. She was there. It was my turn. I spun the bottle. It pointed right at her. She was 15. I'm 20. She starts giggling because I'm like a brother to her. But what am I supposed to do? It's pointing right at her. So I kissed her, except it wasn't like a real kiss because she thought it was so funny, couldn't stop giggling. So I go away to the Navy. Beth starts writing me letters. Wrote me the whole 4 years I'm in the Navy. Oh, she had the most beautiful handwriting. I saved every one of those letters, kept them for years. And then I lost them all in a house fire we had in Mechanicsburg, Pennsylvania. Broke my heart losing those letters. That was a bad thing. But you know what? There was something good that came out of it. because I learned a lesson from that. And the lesson was, don't get too attached to things. Even things like love letters, they're important, but they're not the most important thing. That fire took those letters, but I still had her. So I get out of the Navy. The whole time I'm in there, every time I have leave, I come back to Springfield, I visit the family. I can see how she's blossoming into this beautiful young woman. It just developed from there. When she graduated from high school, she went to nursing school. Oh, she was a wonderful nurse. When I got out of the Navy, I went to Michigan State. That's where my brother had gone, so I went there too. And in sophomore year, I turned 26. Oh, I felt like such an old man with all those kids there. But that year I turned 26. More important, Beth turned 21. I asked her to marry me. It was the craziest thing. I mean, here I am, a sophomore in college. I don't have a clue what I'm going to do with my life. She's just finished nursing school. I asked her to marry me. It was crazy. But you know what was crazier? She said yes. We had 40 wonderful years together. 4 beautiful children. I still think about her every day. So the years go by. The kids are grown. They're gone. We're empty nesters. Beth and I were happy as can be. We're living outside of Hartford, Connecticut. I'm 56 years old. For 22 years, I've been working for the Fireman's Fund Insurance Company. And one Monday, I go into work. The manager calls me into his office. He says, I got a retirement package for you. I hadn't asked for a retirement package, but I knew the manager didn't care for me so much. In an earlier reorganization of the company, I'd gotten grandfathered into a pretty good pay grade, and the manager thought I was costing his office too much money. I had to go. It was a pretty good severance package, but I was 56 years old. I wasn't ready to retire, so it was a shock. Well, the whole time I'm in there talking to the manager, my buddies there at the office, they know what's going on. They call Beth at home. They call my wife, tell her what's happening. And that night, I head home. I don't know what I'm going to say to her. I don't know what I'm going to do. I get there. She was such a beautiful lady. I get home. She meets me at the front door with a glass of champagne. She's all dressed up. She's prepared a candlelight dinner. She is ready to celebrate with me whatever comes next. And you know what? It turned out to be a good thing. Because I looked around a few weeks, found another job with another company where I stayed until I was ready to retire. And that last job was the best job of my whole career. So that's another time when what started out looking like a bad thing turned out to be a good thing. Another time was this stroke. Now, you might think having a stroke is a terrible thing, but this stroke has taught me so much about patience and kindness and how much we all need each other. We're not islands, we're all connected. And if we could just remember that, we would realize how we can get through any kind of bad thing, no matter how bad it seems at the start, if we just stick together. I mean, even this virus thing, what do they call it? COVID something? I mean, right now it looks like a bad thing, but you know what? It might turn out to be a good thing. You never know at the start. We just have to wait and see. Thank you. See you in November.